Number 7, peanut butter bread. Peanut butter during the Depression occupied the nutritional role that meat had previously filled and that meat's increasing unavailability had vacated. Cheap protein, dense calories, a fat content that satisfied hunger in a way that starch alone never quite managed. The agricultural promotion of peanuts by George Washington Carver in the preceding decades had made peanut products widely available and deeply affordable across the American South by the time the Depression hit, and the Southern diet adapted to the protein source it could access with the pragmatism that dietary adaptation always involves. Peanut butter bread was not peanut butter on bread. It was bread made with peanut butter incorporated into the dough. The fat of the ground peanuts replacing the lard or shortening that the recipe might otherwise have called for. The protein of the peanuts added to the protein of the wheat flour, the resulting loaf denser and more nutritious and more satisfying in the hand and in the stomach than plain flour bread could have been. The recipe appeared in Depression-era agricultural extension bulletins distributed through county offices across the South and Midwest. The government's practical acknowledgement that the population needed to know how to make food from what it had, rather than from what recipes assumed it would have. The extension bulletins are among the best documentary records of Depression-era actual cooking, precisely because they were prescriptive rather than aspirational. They described what people could make from what they had, rather than what they might make if circumstances were different. Peanut butter bread sliced thick and eaten with whatever jam the summer's canning had produced fed children before school, adults before work, and families at the end of days when the more elaborate preparations the afternoon had been aimed at had not quite come together. It was reliable in the way that simple things built from stable ingredients are reliable. It asked very little and produced accordingly, not magnificent, not memorable, but solid and nourishing and present when it was needed. Number 6, creamed chipped beef on toast. Here is the meal that survived the Depression, survived the Second World War, where it appeared as a military ration under a name unprintable in this format, and arrived in the 1950s as a nostalgic comfort food before being forgotten entirely by the generations that came after. Chipped beef, paper-thin slices of dried, salted beef sold in small glass jars for a few cents during the Depression and in slightly larger portions through military commissaries during the war, was the protein at the center of a cream sauce made from butter, flour, and milk that was ladled over toast or biscuits and eaten as a complete meal at any time of day. The technique was the white sauce, the basic bechamel that French cuisine considered foundational, and that Depression-era American cooking adopted without the French name and with butter quantities adjusted downward to reflect available supplies. Butter or bacon drippings melted in a pan. An equal weight of flour stirred in and cooked briefly until the raw flour smell disappeared. Milk added slowly while stirring continuously, the sauce thickening with each addition until it reached the consistency that would coat the back of a spoon rather than run off it. The chipped beef added at the end, rinsed first to remove excess salt, torn into rough pieces, folded through the cream sauce until heated. Poured over toast, creamed chipped beef had a richness that came from the fat in the white sauce and a saltiness from the preserved beef that made it taste substantial in a way that its actual meat content, minimal, did not justify. It satisfied hunger with the authority of something more expensive than it was, which was the ambition of every Depression-era recipe worth making. The meal was called different things in different regions. Creamed dried beef, SOS, beef gravy on toast, white gravy with beef. The name varied. The principle was identical. Make the small amount of preserved protein available, stretch across a family's meal through the medium of a cream sauce that turned scarcity into apparent abundance. Number 5, vinegar pie. The Depression-era baker worked with what the pantry held rather than what the recipe assumed it would hold, and the Depression-era pantry held vinegar when it held very little else. Vinegar, produced from fermented apple cider or white wine, or simply from the natural acidification of fruit juice, was one of the most stable and most available flavoring agents in the farm kitchen throughout the 1930s. It lasted indefinitely. It cost almost nothing to produce at home. And in the hands of a baker who understood what acidity did to sweet things. It produced a pie filling from water and sugar and flour and vinegar that tasted, against every reasonable expectation, like something between lemon and apple, tangy and sweet and possessed of a custard-like set that bore no relationship to the simplicity of its ingredients. The filling was made by combining sugar, flour, a beaten egg if eggs were available, butter or lard, water, and a generous quantity of apple cider vinegar. The acid reacting with the starch and the fat and the sugar over heat into a gel that set in the pie shell as it cooled into something firm enough to slice and yielding enough to eat without effort. Spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, which the farm spice cabinet usually held in small quantities, vinegar pie smelled of fall and tasted of something that had no right to exist given what had gone into it. Women made vinegar pie for church suppers and family dinners and sent it to neighbors who had experienced difficulty and needed feeding. The pie said through its existence that the kitchen was still capable of producing something sweet for an occasion that called for sweetness, that the circumstances had not yet stripped away the gesture of making something that was not purely necessary. In the Depression-era moral economy, a vinegar pie brought to a neighbor was a statement about the kind of person the baker still intended to be, despite what the years had done to the kitchen's contents. Number 4, crackling cornbread. The wood-burning stove produced a heat that contemporary cooks cannot fully replicate. Dry, even, ambient, surrounding the pan from multiple directions simultaneously, rather than heating it from a single direction below. The crackling cornbread that came out of a cast iron skillet in a wood-burning oven had a crust on its bottom and sides, and the beginning of a crust on its top that the oven's descending heat added from above, producing a bread with a structural integrity that protected a moist, dense center from the drying that other heat sources would have caused. Cracklings, the small, crisp pieces of rendered pork fat remaining after lard was made by slowly cooking pork fat until its moisture evaporated and the solid pieces floated free in the liquid fat, were the ingredient that made crackling cornbread different from plain cornbread, and that required the hog butchering and lard-making practices of the Depression-era farm kitchen to produce. The cracklings went into the cornbread batter along with the cornmeal and the buttermilk and the leavening, baking soda reacting with the acid of the buttermilk to produce the rise that made the bread light inside its crust, and distributed through the crumb like small savory pockets of pork that melted against the palate with each bite. The specific technique required for the wood-burning stove, the preheated skillet that set the cornbread's bottom crust in the first moments of contact, the oven temperature managed by the arrangement of the wood fire rather than by a thermostat, the judgment of doneness made by color and smell, and the feel of the center when pressed rather than by a timer, cannot be accurately taught to someone who has not worked with that specific equipment across many years. The women who knew how to make crackling cornbread in a wood-burning stove are gone. The wood-burning stoves are gone. What remains is the recipe, which is a set of instructions for a process that required a context that no longer exists, like sheet music for an instrument that no longer exists, technically complete and practically unreproducible. Number 3, lard biscuits. The biscuit that the Depression-era kitchen produced was not the biscuit that contemporary American food culture imagines when it imagines a biscuit. It was made with lard rather than butter, the fat rendered from the family's pigs, stored in crocks used for everything from frying to baking to seasoning to the skincare that farm women applied to hands, cracked by cold and work. Lard produced a biscuit with a specific tenderness, a shorter crumb, a more delicate flake, a texture that butter-based biscuits approximate but never quite achieve, because the different fat crystal structure of lard and butter produces different results in the same flour. The technique was cold hands and a light touch, and the specific understanding that biscuit dough overworked became tough, and that tough biscuits were a waste of flour that could not be absorbed in a kitchen operating on Depression-era margins. The lard was cut into the flour with a pastry blender or with the tips of the fingers, worked until the fat was distributed in pieces ranging from the size of a pea to the size of a small grape, the uneven distribution creating the layers that would separate into flakes in the oven's heat. Buttermilk added until the dough just came together. No more. The less the dough was touched, the better the biscuit. Lard biscuits were made twice a day in farmhouse kitchens throughout the Depression. For breakfast, eaten with whatever the morning offered, and for dinner, eaten with the soup or the stew or the beans that constituted the evening meal. The biscuits provided calories from the fat and starch that the rest of the meal often lacked. They provided the satisfaction of something that required skill to make correctly. A satisfaction that the cook received and that the family received through the evidence of well-made biscuits on the table, which said that someone in this house still had the resources, internal, if not external, to do things properly. The lard is gone from most American kitchens. It left in the 1950s and 1960s when vegetable shortening arrived with marketing that associated lard with old-fashioned poverty and shortening with modern health. The biscuit that replaced it is not the same biscuit. The people who know the difference are old now. The people who do not know the difference do not know what they are missing, because the thing that is missing has been absent long enough for its absence to seem like the normal condition. Number 2, water gravy. Here is the meal that more Americans ate during the Depression than any other single preparation, and that has been so completely forgotten that most people under 60 have never heard its name and would not recognize the dish if it appeared on the table in front of them. Water gravy was made by the same technique as cream gravy. Fat drippings from a pan in which meat or salt pork had been fried, flour stirred in and cooked briefly, liquid added while stirring, with the single substitution that defined its Depression-era identity. Instead of milk, which cost money and required a cow that not every family possessed, water gravy used water. Plain water, drawn from the well or the pump, added to the pan drippings and flour and stirred over heat until the starch thickened and the fat and the residue of whatever had been fried in the pan before created a brown, savory, thin gravy that was poured over biscuits or cornbread or whatever starch the meal had produced. The flavor of water gravy came entirely from the drippings, from whatever had been cooked in the pan before the gravy was made, from the fond of caramelized proteins and sugars left on the pan's surface by the cooking, from the small amount of salt and pepper added at the end. When the drippings were from salt pork, the gravy tasted of smoke and salt. When they were from bacon, of smoke and fat. When there was no meat and the drippings were simply lard, the gravy tasted of fried starch and salt, which is to say it tasted of almost nothing. But almost nothing in a warm brown liquid over hot biscuits was sufficient to constitute dinner, when dinner had no other requirements beyond being warm and present. Water gravy appeared on the Depression-era table so frequently that families developed a terminology for it. Red-eye gravy in the South, made with a splash of coffee added to the ham drippings. Sawmill gravy when thickened more heavily with flour. Pourdu when made thin enough to be transparent. The variations were regional and familial. The principle was universal. Make the nothing into something. Make the something into dinner. Make the dinner into a meal that the family sat down to without comment and ate without complaint, and got up from ready for whatever came next. Number 1. Pinto beans and cornbread. The meal at number 1 is the simplest on this list and the most important. Not the most clever, not the most technically interesting, not the most surprising in what it produced from what it contained. The most important because it was eaten by more people in more places across more years of genuine hardship than any other Depression-era meal, and because it was the meal that, more than any other, kept the American rural poor alive through the years that the economy had decided they were not worth keeping alive. Pinto beans soaked overnight in cold water, drained, covered with fresh water, brought to a boil, and then reduced to a long simmer over the wood stove for 3 to 4 hours with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock or nothing at all, if neither was available. The beans cooked until they were completely soft and the liquid had thickened around them from the starch they released as their skins broke down. A heavy hand of salt at the end. A splash of hot sauce if the shelf held any. Nothing else was required. Cornbread made in the cast iron skillet, cornmeal and buttermilk and bacon drippings, and a pinch of salt and baking soda and an egg if the chickens were laying. baked in the hot oven while the beans finished on the stovetop. The two preparations timed to complete simultaneously so that the cornbread came out of the oven hot and the beans were at their peak thickness, and the table was set and the family sat down to both at the same moment. The beans were ladled into bowls. The cornbread was turned out of the skillet onto a plate and broken into pieces at the table rather than sliced. The breaking of cornbread being the Depression-era family's specific domestic ritual, the moment that said dinner was ready and the family was together and whatever the day had been, this part of it was going to be adequate. Pinto beans and cornbread together constitute a complete protein. The amino acids in the beans and the amino acids in the corn complementing each other in a combination that nutritional science identifies as roughly equivalent to animal protein in its availability to the body. The Depression-era families who ate this meal daily had no knowledge of complementary proteins. They had the accumulated wisdom of generations who had noticed that people who ate beans and cornbread regularly seemed to fare better than those who did not, and they ate accordingly. The meal cost almost nothing. It filled the bowl and the stomach. It produced, in the combination of the thick, creamy beans and the grainy, slightly sour cornbread eaten together, the bean liquid absorbed to the broken cornbread in the bowl, the cornbread providing the textural contrast to the soft beans, the fat of the drippings in the cornbread enriching the bean broth, a satisfaction that was real and that the family recognized as real, and that constituted, in the moral economy of the Depression-era kitchen, enough. Enough was the standard. Enough was the goal. Enough was what Edna, the woman in the Tulsa farmhouse who opened this story, produced every evening from whatever the day had provided and set before 5 children and a husband who had not found work in 14 months. She made enough. For 7 years, through the longest and most difficult period in American economic history, she made enough. The beans were on the stove by mid-morning. The cornbread went in the oven an hour before dark. The family sat down when both were ready and ate without comment and got up from the table, ready for what came next. The cast iron skillet went back on the stove. The pot went back on the burner. Tomorrow would require the same thing from the same woman with the same resources, which is to say, whatever existed and the intelligence and the determination to make it sufficient. She did. They all did. That is the history that these 15 meals contain, and it belongs to everyone who descended from the people who ate them and survived, which in the American story is a very great number of people indeed. Which of these 15 Depression-era meals did you recognize? Drop your answer in the comments. And if your grandmother or great-grandmother made any of these, tell us what she called it and what she served it with. The names vary by region and family, but the knowledge behind them is the same knowledge, and it deserves to be remembered before the last person who received it directly stops being able to pass it on.